Hello, everyone online. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. So the power which I have, I'm going to stop soon. I want to talk, make the best use of all the time I have here with Stacy. So before we start, I just want to make sure that I acknowledge the way I would want to here today. So as I acknowledge my status as a settler on, or a new settler on the stolen land of the Gadigal people of the Euro Nation, I recognize that colonialism and imperialism persist in the present, not merely as relics of the past, which even Julie today reminded us briefly during our meeting. So discussing epistemic practice within the discipline of bioethics as a tribal scholar from India, who learns from various indigenous and critical scholarship, especially Black feminist scholarships, I stand in solidarity with all anti-colonial struggles. In doing so, I remind myself that unjust epistemic practices and genocides are two sides of the same settler colonial coin. And today's session is perfect, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this ongoing conversation, which I've been having with different scholars, but with Stacy, I'm really excited for this. So because we are trying to question and understand the epistemic practices through methodological discussions in so-called empirical bioethics. So I'm delighted that Stacy Carter is with us today, and though she hardly needs an introduction to those present here, let me offer a brief overview, begin with the conscious of time. Professor Carter serves as the Director of Empirical Ethics and Health at Achieve within the School of Health and Society at the University of Wollongong. Her team was so brilliant when I was there, so thank you. She has contributed extensively to a wide ranging of applied ethics topics, with recent work focusing on AI, public health promotions, and also deliberative democracy and deliberative democracy methods. I encourage you to explore her work and her team's work for further information, of course. So to introduce today's format, it's essentially a dialogue or a critical conversation. The idea was to bring in a scholar with whom I would want, or the SHE team would want to engage deeply. And my own agenda, which is no longer a secret, is to brainstorm and reflect publicly with Stacy. So we both decided on this format. I have 4 questions, just again for the time purpose, and we will see how the timing goes, and then we'll explore further. So in the first 30 minutes, we will have the conversation and you will all witness this. And then we will all continue the conversation for the next 30 minutes. And then during the lunch, we will continue more. That's the idea. So as time is ticking, here's the first question, Stacy. In your commentary on beware dichotomies and grand abstractions, which I very much resonate. And when I read Alexander Kahn's paper, which you were responding to, I wish I had the social capital to respond to these class elitism, especially the class elitist journals, particularly in bioethics. And I was so glad to read your response, as in my other works, I reflect on demystifying theory, the idea of theory and methods, and also to avoid false dichotomy, which you emphasize in that paper, in this commentary. So in that article, you mentioned what empirical methods can do for bioethics. And you distance from methodologically based typology. You mentioned that there. With this in mind, could you share more to start with? How do you identify yourself? I know it's a question which is tricky sometimes, but still I would like to ask you, as ethicists doing empirical research, right? And also I remember reading in many of your works, you talk about as a qualitative researcher going to bioethics, not the other way around. So as I am in my own process of reflecting and in my own writings too, and I'm having my own existential crisis with epistemic practices generally, I'm questioning what is the purpose of theory? And I have come or still in journey of what theory is for me. So I'm asking you the question. Yeah.
Where would you like me to start?
Where you want,
please. So what am I and how am I positioned? And where is theory?
What is theory? What is the purpose of theory?
And what we do? Oh, say hello, everyone.
Hi.
It's so fun. I never get to just like think for an hour. So like, this is amazing. Yeah, I don't know who I am anymore, actually, to be honest. I think I used to have a stronger sense of myself. And you know what? So thanks to all of you beautiful people. Moving institutions made me realize how much that identity actually came from the community that I was in. And anyone who's been part of the Sydney Health Ethics community knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? That there's this deep kind of groundedness and also interdisciplinarity as a normalized thing in bioethics that's actually really weird about she and is like the best thing ever. And that means that anyone who cares about doing normative work can fit into that culture. And I've tried to rebuild that at Wollongong, but it's so different kind of leading something as opposed to being a part of something. You know, it's like a really different positioning. And where I'm positioned in the institution that I am in now is really different as well. So to be honest, I'm not sure who I am anymore. And a lot of the time I'm just a middle manager. Supriya was asking, where's my methodological voice gone in the literature earlier? I said, I don't know. It's like, it doesn't actually exist anymore. So in terms of positioning, I don't really think of myself as a qualitative researcher anymore. I do think of myself as doing applied ethics. I now seem to use the terminology of applied ethics quite a lot rather than bioethics. Maybe that's like a cowardly sidestepping of some of the kind of tensions within bioethics proper as a discipline, maybe. And I'm increasingly doing deliberative work, which is partly why I'm kind of more engaged, I think, with those debates at the moment rather than debates with kind of empirical bioethics, empirical bioethics, maybe. Although like still engaging to an extent with that literature, and like I'm working with Jane and also with Eve and with colleagues on contributing chapters to the handbook on empirical bioethics, and there's stuff that we're doing that's still situating us there. But yeah, I guess that's a very long way around of saying maybe all of our positionality kind of shifts through our experiences and who we work with, and something that maybe we can come back to that I became interested in having the opportunity to reread your work, which was amazing, and to have access to the preprint, was thinking about reflexivity as relationality. What does it mean to think of reflexivity in a relational way rather than in an introspective way? And I've been reflecting on that a lot as I've been preparing for this conversation. So maybe we can come around to that. But as we know from all of the social constructivist kind of social science that we've ever been embedded in, who we are shifts according to who we're with, you know, who we're engaging with, and the self that we are in any context is different than the self that we are in any other context. So I feel like I'm quite flexible in that way. Theory, I still love the interactionist idea of theory as a line along which to look, you know, so it's a tool. Any kind of theory, whether ideal or mid-range theory, can open you up to new ways of seeing the world. So for me, it's not about being committed to a particular body of theory and being an identified theorist of something, so much as it's about having access again to the relational networks that provide the theoretical resources that will provide new directions along which to look, so that we're not just doing a surface level descriptive account of what people say to us, but we're actually engaging in a way that might produce some new ways of seeing.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's so much I would like to unpack. The question of self and the relational self to the institutions which we are embedded, right? At the same time, the larger how bioethics as a discipline is so interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and then how do we position ourselves? And you touched upon, and then it changes. So the time is so central. At the same time, the relational aspect, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking around this. But let's go back to reflexivity. I think we should touch again, and maybe there's one question which I have there to ask you more about the positionality and how do you think reflexive practice in itself, where positionality is one aspect, but the larger aspect of the practice of reflexivity within both theory and methodology, what does it do? And questioning back to theory. But following on that, I would like to take what you talked about, the aspect of methods, and you said you don't identify yourself as qualitative researchers. So now this is the next question which I'm going to connect back there, is what are your thoughts on the aspect of integration as underlying focus on empirical bioethics? How do you understand the methods and methodologies for conducting empirical bioethics within this interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary field, where we learn, we borrow sometimes, we transgress sometimes to different disciplines or locations, right? So for instance, there is a lot of labeling which is happening within the so-called empirical bioethics, whether we have symbiotic bioethics, we have reflexive bioethics. There is a lot of super specialized way of creating the space, which sometimes the larger ecosystem which we are, right, in the neoliberal spaces which we are, we want to keep this to apply for grants or to keep our identity. And there are different reasons. With all this, now the question which I had is, how do you make sense of the integration in empirical bioethics? Because I remember reading with your works and me resonating too, there is no integration when we don't have this dichotomy, which you're talking about one of your work too, right? There's no false dichotomy. So please.
That's such a great question. And those of you that had time to look at it felt so indulgent having our work attached to this meeting. I'm sorry to like make you read our papers, and it was interesting going back to them actually. So those of you that had time to skim the stuff that I'd written, particularly in response to John and Mikey's work, right? There was that huge epic thing that they did in Europe where they tried to bring together scholars from all over Europe and get them to agree on what empirical bioethics was and how it should be done. I mean, man, like so much respect even just for trying to do that.
Yeah.
And then both myself and Alan Cribb were invited to respond in the journal to the paper that they published reporting on this. And it was really fun because Alan and I did that completely independently, and we submitted the responses. And you might, if you've ever read Mikey and John's response to Alan and my responses, it says in like paragraph 2 or something, we read the responses with a wry smile because somehow both Alan and Stacy managed to imagine exactly what went on in the room, even though we didn't say it in the paper, which is hilarious. And one of the things that both Alan and I talked about was this notion of integration. So John and Mikey, often with Alan and with other people like Hitchcock and various others, Lucy Fried, have done more than most to try to define what this thing called empirical bioethics is, and they've made integration really central to that. And in my view, that arises from a particular interpretation of Hume and the idea that somehow fact and value need to be bridged in particular ways, and that the integration of those two things is kind of what makes empirical bioethics. So going back to your first very prescient question about theory, right? And Jane and I have been talking about this a lot with our colleague Annette because we're writing this chapter at the moment that's supposed to be basically saying what even is empirical methods in bioethics for a handbook on empirical bioethics. And so we've been asking exactly this question, like, what isn't this just a chapter on qualitative research? Like, how is it actually empirical bioethics? And I think if you believe the interactionists, if you think of theory as directions along which to look, and if you think of your way of engaging with the world as being necessarily shaped by whatever theoretical resources you have available to you, whether they're in your head or whether you get them from conversations with your colleagues, then I can't actually see how that's not going to influence what you see in the world. Like, that's actually going to influence what you attend to. It's going to influence the questions that you ask. It's going to influence the way you analyze the data that you get. The theory's already there, so for me, and I know this is somewhat different to the way that many leaders in the field are thinking, and I totally respect their reasoning as well, and I can see where it comes from. But for me, doing empirical bioethics is doing empirical work that is always already normatively inflected, and that from the very, very beginning, you are, and I'm really just parroting stuff that Jackie Leach-Scully's been saying for 2 decades. So props to Jackie for kind of holding this line for a really long time. Really, I think what we're doing in empirical bioethics is saying, guess what? Regular folks are making moral choices all the time. Regular folks are making judgments about the right and the wrong thing to do, what ought we to do all the time. Surely that everyday normativity actually has value and should be brought into the way that we draw conclusions. And as Jackie says, that doesn't mean that we just parrot what people say. It also doesn't mean that we just somehow can extract it as some kind of decontextualized truth out of those people. And there it is, there's what people think. What we see is shaped by the theory that we have in our heads already, the questions that we ask. And I don't think I'm telling anyone in this room anything that they don't already know. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But for me, integration kind of almost misses what's unique about empirical bioethics, which is it's not about doing a qualitative research project and then doing some theorizing because you've got some new facts. It's about approaching the world as always already normatively inflected and engaging with that normativity, and then asking questions about, okay, well, what's the effect that that normativity is actually having? Do I think that's a good thing or a bad thing? Like, how do I make sense of that normativity in the context of what I know about other ways of reasoning about ethics?
Oh, thanks so much. I mean, I very much resonate with. I think that's the position which I hold much more in my works too, where the knowledge is situated, which you resonate to, and I very much resonate in that. And this is the next question, which, while acknowledging the standardization, it's happening within the empirical bioethics, acknowledging the breadth of work many scholars are doing in this field, but at the same time questioning these knowledge practices, for me is where the following question is knowledge is situated, right, as we acknowledge. So in your paper, it's debating diversity. You mentioned you reflect on the methodological standardization in bioethics and its implications to bioethics. Could you further walk us along more? But at the same time, I just want to talk about why I'm asking this question. It's like I'm particularly keen to hear from the perspective of politics of location, in historical, spatial, and the power relationships, and at the same time, the locations which we hold on. So because I'm increasingly finding challenging, especially with how do we resist this gatekeeping and boundaries, especially in the multidisciplinary discipline, which is who holds the power to hold what is theory enough, or good theory enough, what is normative enough, or what's not, those questions. And also going back to the politics of location and the reflective practice, which we touched upon here and there. So could you tell more about what role politics of location plays in the larger work of standardization?
Yeah. So reading the old papers, I was so struck by, and thinking about your question, I was so struck by how, and this isn't meant to be dismissive. I think it's a really cute thing about humans that we keep cycling back to the same problems. So it's really interesting to be in a position to be led to reflect on the fact that empirical bioethics is essentially doing what qualitative research was doing in about 2001. So like we've been here before.
Yeah.
But this is not a new debate, and I don't think qualitative research did it for the first time either, right? Like this is the same kind of set of ideas and the same concerns. And in a way, the fact that we keep having these debates is a good thing, because it means we're being reflexive. We're actually asking questions about, how do we justify the knowledge that we're producing? What does a good methodology look like? And so, in what sense can I justify the way that I'm working? That they all seem like very good questions to ask, right? So when I was a firebrand qualitative researcher in 2001, and I'd read Denton and Lincoln from cover to cover more than once, and I was ready to storm the barricades on behalf of qualitative research. I was working in a context that was very randomized controlled trial heavy and not very many qualitative researchers. Julie was there as well. We were
your talk from then.
And Claire was there not very long after. So at that time, very influenced by those 1990s qualitative methodologists, I was all like, screw standardization, you positivist bastards. We refuse. We're going to do our own thing, and we've got integrity, and you can trust us, we're doing this right. I really took on that positioning, which is the way that qualitative researchers position themselves at that time. And it was political. It was profoundly political. It was about pushing out, making space, resisting the status quo. I have become so freaking compliant, seriously, like the number of checklists that I've submitted with my papers in the last 5 years. 2001 Stacy would be horrified at how compliant 2021 Stacy has become with standardization, because it does work in the world, right? So the older I get, the more I want the work I do to actually have a big impact. And that's partly what's led me into deliberation, because I can see that by doing really robust deliberation and robust, it really connects with that idea of standardization. Ministers, listen, you can actually get decision makers to pay attention to what matters to ordinary people in the world and their moral reasoning if you've got quality claims that they're prepared to believe in. And that ability to actually make a difference feels more and more important to me now. Whereas back in 2001, what I really cared about was methodological quality, and not that I don't care about that now, but actually more accurate, the performance of a particular kind of epistemic and methodological position was very important to my growing professional identity. You know, that was a big part of how I positioned myself and understood myself and made space for myself in the world. So yeah, I feel like it's shifted a lot for me over time. So I'm still not a huge fan of the checklist, but I'm more pragmatic about it than I used to be, I think. And I still think what John and Mikey and others are trying to do around at least having a conversation, and they say this isn't meant to close things down, you know, it's meant to start a conversation about what good research looks like in this field. I still think that's worth doing, as long as it doesn't constrain the work that we do.
Scholar from Global South, I feel it constrains for different reasons, and maybe that's another whole topic in itself, like how the politics works within the knowledge practices.
Do you want to talk about that for a second?
I mean, the reason why I say this is, like, for example, when I was in India, so far when I was in India, when I used to submit certain kind of papers, because I'm not trained as a philosopher, I'm not trained in a certain disciplinary orientation. So what it does is I found my own voice in different ways, which not palatable or not theory enough, not normative enough to global North scholars who are the ones who are setting the standards. And what does it mean? I'm not saying that they have bad intention or anything, but that's what the institutions does. And that goes back to the questions which you ended very brilliantly with deliberative democracy, because I'm not familiar with the work around deliberative democracy, but having read some works on participatory approaches, and then what it means to work with community, and then epistemic practices, how do we do there? And so I just want to push back again question here, I know because of the time, because I'm also moderating here. So what I'll ask you the question is, in your works on deliberative democracy, which you highlighted because it's a pragmatic approach, which you said to have an impact, right? Which is so central for applied ethicists for us. And that's what many of the policymakers and scholars who are working in the space are actually practicing that. And but at the same time, thinking around the concerns around the risk of co-optation by system and institution of domination, including representatives or government or large think tanks, when we do work with such organizations, what are we bringing and how do the power relationships work? So, and myself being in Australia as a tribal scholar in India, for a better name here, it's indigenous, but in India, again, because of the post-colonial context which we are, the language in itself is, so the translator is like, let me say it's a tribal scholar. But as a new settler in this country, and I'm thinking around, I've been attending a couple of workshops within university and across, I went to ANU recently on decolonizing philosophy, and then listening to the works, this is the question which I'm thinking about, is being on the stolen land, how do we think deliberative democrats or methodologists conduct research or build a theory that is in solidarity with vulnerable and marginalized communities, not necessarily with always indigenous communities, with any marginalized, and sometimes we feel like we are all in a marginalized in certain ways, but at the same time, we need to emphasize the larger institutional and reflective practice there. And also, when engaging with highly disputed political matters, because you also mentioned everything is political because the normative assumptions, the value system which we have, then how do you think deliberative democracy will not co-opt into the larger systems of domination, or that we cater to the needs, but at the same time, because we want to be pragmatic, but at the same time, how do we make sure we resist this co-optation?
Great questions. So shall we take marginalization first and co-optation second, maybe? So I think generally speaking, most empirical research, typically, empirical bioethics research is pretty crap at doing a good job of engaging with marginalized populations. I mean, that's a very sweeping statement, but generally speaking, I think that's the case. With some incredible exceptions of people that have amazing skills and actually do a great job. I think deliberative democracy increasingly has appealed to me partly because of the strategy that it uses to directly deal with that as a problematic for research practice. So, well, if recruitment is of good quality and if you provide the right supports, actually deliberative processes can genuinely include marginalized voices in the way that other kinds of empirical methods can't. Because you're giving people a really long time, you're potentially coaching them to be able to get to a position where they're able to contribute. You're giving people lots of information so they really understand the thing that they're engaging with, rather than kind of just giving you front of mind opinions on something that it's kind of hard for them to get their head around, which particularly for complex policy problems or for new tech is actually quite a step change, to have an opportunity to learn about something rather than just to go, oh, I don't really know what that is, but here's what I think.
Right.
And we've really gotten to a point now, particularly with using very robust recruitment methods, that we're able to put together national juries that are majority people that only have a school level education, for example, because that's, or almost, like 45%, because that's what the population actually looks like. And to provide those people with lots of support, or that have proportional representation of cultural diversity. I have a huge grant in at the moment that has a big component, which is working with some wonderful First Nations colleagues of mine on the question, is it even appropriate to do deliberative democracy with Indigenous peoples? And if it is, how do you do it? And how do you make decisions about how to design it? And if we get that funded, my wonderful First Nations colleagues who are leaders in Indigenous health research will lead that work appropriately, and will work with Aboriginal communities to try and answer those questions. They're not mine to answer. But that question is a really contested question. But in terms of marginalisation, I think actually deliberative methods do better than most empirical methods do. Co-optation, I think actually there's lots of things built into deliberative methods that are about, interestingly, not leaving it to the researcher. So this brings us back to the focus on reflexivity, right? So having independent oversight of the process, having lots of checks and balances, having many people involved in the design, like that. There's ways of opening it up and making it transparent that actually are really uncomfortable as a researcher, because if you're a qualitative researcher, particularly if you're accustomed, as I have been, in working in this way that is like, oh, well, I'm a qualitative researcher and I work inductively and I really understand what I'm doing epistemically and methodologically, and I'm just going to get out there and see what happens, and I'll work it out, and I know enough that I can get ethics approval appropriately, and I'll send an amendment in if things change, and let's go, let's work it out. Deliberative processes are not like that at all. There's all this front ending and there's all these other stakeholders involved, and you've got a lot less control, but so do they. Yeah. It's all negotiated and it's all transparent. So I think it actually provides strategies for helping to resist co-optation that perhaps it's a little bit easier for co-optation to creep in if you're doing the kind of solo, trust me, I'm reflexive kind of version of doing research. Maybe.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. So much I want to ask you, but because of the time, what I'm going to do is what is the role of objectivity in empirical bioethics with all this taken? And then let's talk more.
Supriya. We've got how long?
I know. That's the reason I wanted to make.
Oh, goodness, objectivity. I think objectivity is a concept that can be defined in many ways. And for me, the most useful way to think about objectivity is to think of it as the thing that an appropriately defined community of scholars or stakeholders can agree is the way things are at present, rather than any kind of absolute unbiased search for some kind of truth, which I think we agree is always misguided. So for me, it's about coming back to relationality. It's about our responsibility to our colleagues, our openness to critique, our being part of the conversation, so that we're actually contributing to the way that thinking's developing in the field, none of which I think I probably live up to well enough, but, you know, we aim to take that position. And that, to my mind, it's only through being a part of that community of critique that we can ever approach anything that sort of might be something like what we mean when we say objectivity. I certainly don't feel like we can ever extract an unbiased truth from anybody or any situation.
Thanks, Stacy. Okay, now I'll just shut up and I'll not ask questions. But let's hear more. For people who are online, please raise your hand just to make sure. I'll take questions from in person here and then from online. Yeah, please raise. Okay, I'll make a note. One second. Can I borrow this so that you can hear?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes.
I'll just.
Well, the microphone is in the ceiling.
Oh, yeah. Just
I'm going to just try.
That's right. Yeah.
You hear on mic?
Can someone just thumbs up?
I'll be more boomy then.
Okay.
Folks at home, can you hear the question?
Oh,
Yeah, thank you,
perfect. Yeah. Oh, great.
Oh, Mikey's here. Oops, not going to say what I'm going to say then.
Mikey, someone is. Go ahead.
Stacy, amazing to see you again. I'm really interested about your views towards the use of checklists and standardization as a marker of quality in qualitative or bioethics type research. I've noticed that there's kind of more a movement to using these kind of checklists, and you said they're really useful in, you know, policy-based decisions. But can they also be used as kind of almost like a signal for quality when there's a lack of discussion of, you know, epistemological and methods and methodological questions as well? I'm just curious on your take on that.
Totally, yes. I completely think that that is the case. I think they're good and flawed. Right? But I kind of find when I use them, it often reminds me to report something that I forgot. So that doesn't seem like a bad thing. Just as a kind of thought prompt, they seem like a good thing. And I probably should be more disciplined in trying to remember to use them in design as well, you know, like ahead of time, so that, you know, you've got that thing to report later. Because I still tend to work in that qualitative way of feeling like I know what I'm doing and not necessarily using those structured approaches at the very start. But at the same time, I think it's perfectly possible that people just tick the boxes and haven't actually done any of it. Or, I mean, how many times have you reviewed a paper where people have used terminology that make it, or use language that make it clear that actually none of this is coherent? And in a way, actually, Supriya, and we've talked about this, one of the worst examples of that is people dumping a kind of confessional diary entry like at the top of something, and then it disappears. It's like, well, where's that in any of this? Like, so you've just told me, you know, the précis of your life to this point, and now I don't have any sense of how that is relevant at all to what you've reported afterwards, which doesn't feel like reflexivity to me. It feels like a kind of performative to position yourself for a particular audience and not particularly epistemically useful at all. So I wrote a chapter that is lost. Don't never publish your early methodological work in an obscure book because no one will ever read it. But I published a chapter that I really liked, which actually argued that, in fact, quality, the most important marker of quality, it came after that 2007 paper, is that your epistemology and your methodology and your method are actually coherently kind of connected. And if they fit together, and if people can see that you practice them in a way that is coherent, that should be the quality marker. But not everyone knows enough about doing research to be able to make that judgment, right? That's quite a high level judgment. So I guess the checklists are helpful.
An imperfect kind of,
But also the training with qualitative research, at least my understanding is like over the time period, it's like an art, but also craft. You keep practicing, and then people around your community learn, we all learn from each other, whatever you left out. But at the same time, the transparency and trustworthiness, I feel, rather than using, again, the positive frameworks, which we just fall into when we talk about qualitative research, or like, I don't know, that's how I would feel like, how do we make sure we are trustful and accountable for the practices? Hochi?
I'm always asking questions, but someone else. Okay.
Please.
Okay. So my question is about thanks first, Stacy. I really enjoyed it. About the the notion of robust deliberative what's that? The deliberative democracy methodology. Okay. So I was wondering whether or not the criteria of robustness are outcome oriented or they are more process oriented. So I was thinking that if they are outcome oriented or more outcome oriented, then you might think that, okay, a deliberative democracy project is more robust if certain outcomes are more manifest or clear. But if the emphasis is on the process, so you are more concerned with how people, with how you gather your data or knowledge, so to speak. So yeah, is that clear? I mean, yeah, okay. So I was wondering whether or not you think that both are equally relevant. One is more relevant, or maybe my question is entirely mistaken. Yeah,
No, great question. And I think the answer is genuinely both, but the focus is often more process, like more on the process. If you don't generate the kind of outcome that deliberative methods are meant to generate, which is actionable, well-reasoned recommendations that are useful to policy, then it's also not a good process. You know, like it's not a robust process if you don't have that output, because that's really the whole purpose of the process. But all of the elements of design are significant in making a claim to robustness. So the recruitment and sampling, the way that you work with people, the quality of the deliberation itself in the room between the participants, the quality of the facilitation, the oversight, you know, all of that stuff is usually packaged up into the conception of what robust is. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. So Mikey?
Thanks, Stacey. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Extremely well.
That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. And it's, you know, great to have these chances to discuss and converse like this. So I think what strikes me as common ground in much of the work that everyone is doing is this commitment to deliberation. And I think, yeah, both the democratic deliberative approaches and many of the integrated methodologies, at least the ones that have legs, commit to questions about how we deliberate in context, in the right kind of way to make progress on ethical questions. And then all the academic issues seem to me to be around who should be involved in that deliberation, how should it be structured, what are the norms for its conduct, etc., etc. And I think you raised a lot of important questions about that. I want to raise a couple of worries about the deliberative democratic method of deliberative exchange in this context, motivated by some observations from Singapore, where I work and live now. So one slight concern, I guess, is the commitment to the democratic qualifier to deliberation. A citizens' jury, by definition, unless you modify the name, is a commitment to the involvement of citizens. Now, where I live, 1.7 million people aren't citizens, and it's 1.7 million people who face many of the significant ethical challenges in the policy context. So I guess we could kind of just abandon the commitment to a citizens' jury and talk about a political jury or political deliberation or something. But the tying it to a sort of norm of citizenry seems like it could potentially be problematic. And the second worry is linked to the first, and it's about the ways in which public deliberation can get legs or is accepted within certain, let's say, not so democratically committed societies. You know, there are very significant constraints on policy formation mechanisms in many countries that would seemingly deny the possibility of these methods getting traction because of their political norms that orientate them. Does that potentially have the impact of a sort of unintended but secondary marginalizing effect, possibly? Thank you.
Yeah, there's such great questions, Mikey. I agree with you completely on the citizens' jury thing. I think it's very, very unfortunate wording. So we always recruit residents and citizens, not only citizens, for exactly the reasons that you outline. And what to call these things is really tricky. We often call them deliberative democratic approaches or processes rather than citizens' juries. But I think Tamara might want to weigh in on that as well. Having been involved in some stuff in Singapore. So totally agree with you that there's real issues there. On co-optation, absolutely. So some regimes some jurisdictions that are notoriously oppressive have not only been excited about using deliberative approaches, but have mandated their use in some local contexts so that local governments are punished for not doing deliberative processes within the jurisdiction for which they are responsible, demonstrating that you can co-opt just about any method. I think you might then argue, perhaps going back to the question of theory, that these methods are meant to be deeply informed by theory of politics and government, and you might then contend that perhaps in that context we're not really living up to the democratic ideal, that there's all kinds of things that aren't happening in that context that mean that this isn't genuinely a democratic engagement. It might still be deliberative, but I totally agree with you that it will be deeply constrained. So yeah, I think both of your objections are very sound. And I wish that Ned, what's his name, hadn't called them citizens jury. It's like, it's very, very problematic terminology. Tamara.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry.
Yeah, Jean, but go ahead.
Oh, no,
It's a follow-up.
yeah. I mean, I was actually thinking about the exact same things that Mikey was before he raised them, and I was just going to follow up. So it just got me thinking about what you were talking earlier about, Supriya, about the colonization, and particularly I noticed that I got quite sensitive to that doing the citizens jury in Singapore. Not so much of the democratic, it is a kind of semi-democracy, but that idea of that citizens are going to be playing a role in judgment when they don't have a common law sort of system. So there amongst quite senior policymakers, that they were a bit sensitive that, well, look, we pay judges lots of money. Like, why is this system of decision making going to be it's supposed to be better? You're saying it's better than ours, that somehow. So I think that, I think that the citizens jury terminology will, should change. But in terms of how you then justify its robustness without that framework, I didn't get to. But I might do, because we've got some funding to do some more in the next few years. So I think that's a conversation to keep moving on.
Yeah, and also, I mean, something that obviously we all can see, but it also challenges bioethics, right? Because it's kind of pushing up against the normativity of bioethics and saying, where are the edges of that? Are we still in bioethics, or are we moving into politics? Bioethics is always political.
Yes, yeah.
But now this is really political. So it does kind of push those edges around what bodies of normative theory are most relevant to the work we do, and can we even do bioethics without paying attention to that broader theoretical context of political science and government.
Okay.
It's another tiny finger, actually, and you would know this better than me, Jane and Stacy, but Chris Degeling, who a lot of us also work with, tends to talk now of community juries. And I think that is both for perhaps some of the reasons we've discussed here, but also specific methodological reasons, in that to call something a citizens jury, it has to have a very particular and potentially narrower set of attributes. But I just thought, for the general discussion, I just thought I'd flag that term is also being used. You may or may not agree with Chris's position on that, but certainly the work I've done, that's how.
So we kind of had a way of doing, and we still do some of these, a way of doing deliberative processes that was about us going to diverse communities, and they're the ones that we tend to label community juries. As opposed to, last year I did a big national process, and that one I ended up referring to as a citizens jury, because it really kind of was, it was much more about everyone in the jurisdiction having an equal opportunity to participate. And I was much more along those kind of lines.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jen, I'll just quickly follow up. There's so many lines of thought. Is like, on one hand, we think about community participation, or when we work with community, it's not an innocent. Who becomes part of a community? How do we identify? I mean, it's a very powerful space to engage with, and that again goes back to the other aspect of theory and practice. How do we bridge, and which theory can we work with, and bioethics? So it reminds me of the questions of activism, advocacy, and theory, as if we are doing it separately, but can we ever do that in the applied ethics space? Is another, but I know, maybe Jane, just my
I
thoughts.
wasn't going to talk about deliberation at all. So if anyone else has a,
Yeah, I do, but you go first because you've been waiting.
okay, all right. I'm disrupting flow of conversation. I was interested to go back, Stacey, to what you said about objectivity. I'm sorry.
No.
But, and actually, it might be a little thing that Mikey as well, actually, because I was interested in what you said about the community of scholars sort of creating norms, if you like. And this goes to the way that we standardize things and have accepted standards. As you know, I've been looking a lot recently at empirical bioethics methods and not finding myself in any of them, which sort of made me reflect a little bit on what you mentioned about the process that John led in Europe. And also even back to all of those 80s consensus conferences, right? And thinking about who gets to be in the room when there is a consensus conference. And if we think of John's work as an extension of that consensus conference, what does that mean for an objective norm, for a discipline, or for a kind of methodological practice when you kind of start to feel a bit confused about who am I, what do I do? Because, and I say this having just read a paper from Julian Savulescu about RE-NEs. I don't know, some
Reflective
method,
equilibrium.
whatever it is.
Reflective
And I'm just like, I don't
Reminds me of Miles and the discourse communities.
know. But yeah, I'm just wondering how that reflects on the idea of objectivity as being created by a community of practice.
And also it really connects with what Supriya was saying about most probably the global north and the global south, but also just generally, you know, perhaps you could say kind of elite scholarship versus marginal scholarship, you know, like the, yeah. So I think you are putting your finger on a way in which the kind of collective community of scholars' view of objectivity actually has a real weakness, which is, you know, what community and how did they get there? And I think you're absolutely right. So, and it's interesting. So going back to what I was saying much earlier about how much my academic identity was shaped by what at the time was Vellum and now is she. It's interesting how we can actually make lacunae and we can make our own communities in which we make our own standards of practice. And then it's quite jarring when we go outside of those communities and go, wait, what? What do you mean you don't get this?
And I experienced it in the opposite way, coming from UK back into She. And I was like, what do you mean we don't have to like talk about methodology all the time? I was very, I had it was a different disconnect.
Yeah. So it is, I think it really is all relational in the end. And I guess the best we can do is to try to be inclusive ourselves, try to be transparent to each other. And this is all very motherhood and hand wavy. So, you know, but what else have we got? You know, what else can we do? And it doesn't feel very helpful to me to be using standards as a hammer to hit people with. I think it's got to be a conversation. It's got to always be open and it always changes. But what we do now, even as qualitative research, is quite different than what we were doing.
The center of humility in this theory building is so central, and how do we practice it regularly and keep checking for ourselves, right? Yeah. Julie.
So values are inherent in all decisions, whether they're acknowledged or not. And your work is trying to draw those out to inform policy decisions, which I've worked with you on and with you and Chris and love it. How do you get policymakers to care about community, public, citizen values? And can you give us an example of where that you've seen that actually happen, where there's been an outcome from doing that?
So this goes back to the excellent earlier question about the work standards do, and also the excellent earlier question about what is robust. So I've done lots and lots of projects on the community jury model now. Like, you know, we fly to 3 or 4 really diverse communities. We have a conversation over 2 days, like 1.5 days, where people learn some stuff and then they talk, and then we've got a sense of what their priorities are. But we tended to report those in terms of variation in the group. You know, like, so this many people voted for that, this many people voted for that. Here's the reasons that they were different. Here's the values that seem to be underpinning that variation. So quite values focused. Really hard to get policy traction. Why? If you're a policymaker, what do you even do with that? So there's diversity, different people value different things. I don't know what to do with that, so I'm going to go on with what I'm already doing. Right? So then last year I did this big national jury with sortition, which is a very demanding process of recruitment. So people are invited in proportion to where they live in the whole country. We sent out printed invitations to 6,000 people. We used an algorithm to match the people we selected against the demographics of the country. So in the room, we had the diversity of ancestry. We had like 45% people that hadn't gone past school level education. We had equal men and women and non-binary, like we had some non-binary people. We had like, all of the things that we wanted, we had represented in the people that were in the room. That has been such a crazy game changer. Like I had no idea what difference it would make. And we said to those people, you need to generate recommendations and you need to say why. And we're only going to report the recommendations that 80% of you can agree on. This is a typical practice. It's called supermajority. So it's typical practice in deliberative democracy. The recommendations of the jury are the recommendations that 80% of people can agree on. I have got decision makers across the country wanting to essentially insert the recommendations into what they're doing in this territory. And I'm pretty sure it's the different kind of recruitment and sampling and the different kind of output that has made the main difference. I mean, people are also really interested in the other process stuff. And that helps to shore up their faith in it. But those two things seem to have really been a game changer. And so it's very hard. It's so much harder than just going on some nice flights to some lovely communities and having some lovely chats with people. Like it's just so much more difficult. Yeah. But it kind of feels worth the effort because you really get people listening and can wake people up to the idea that actually everyday normativity is worth engaging.
What's the topic?
Artificial intelligence. That also helped. Yeah.
So how many people did you end up with?
So we recruited 30 people. And that's also really tricky, right? You need enough people that everyone can talk to everyone to get to know what everyone thinks and exchange views and potentially change their mind. You also need enough people to manage a process. So some people do like up to 100 in a citizens assembly. Occasionally there's been even bigger ones like 200, 250. The wheels sometimes fall off those because they're a bit too big. So yeah, it's tricky balance and expensive.
Yeah,
it gets the load.
Yeah, this just reminds me of talking about, representation and then the institutional support. As a representation, on one hand, can we get all the insights and then have a value commitment when we don't have institutional support? I don't know whether it makes sense in the deliberative democracy and how do we navigate that? Because you try your best to bring all the people from the community on board to work with, but having people on board, and because this reminds me of the question in India, like the doctors I was working with, and if I wanted to do a co-design project with them, I would not agree with them. Now, for example, certain value system, like they really genuinely believe doctors knows best, and I'm like, no. And that clash was very central, and how do I work with them was the center. That's the reason I'm thinking of. What do you have any quick thoughts on that? On the representation, does it mean equal to, representation of the community, does it mean that we can work with the same value system? Like, for example, like as I was mentioning, the doctors, let's say if the community in India that having a patriarchy or a certain value system, and then I'm not generalizing, not a blanket statement that all doctors think that way, but let's say if they genuinely think that doctors knows best is the right value commitment there, and we need to start from there. And me as a researcher, like now what do we do about it? How do we work with?
Yeah, I mean the thing about this process is that it's not just about us anymore. So generally there's other people in the room that will act as a corrective against certain positions. So people are trading views and people are objecting to each other's views and people are bringing each other around. So it becomes this very participatory, very agentic kind of setting for trying to make sense of something positively, as opposed to just the researcher and what we can extract from our participants. Yeah.
So that there is no end there of a theory. It's more of the process in itself does that, right?
Yeah. So very process oriented.
Yeah, okay. Great. Oh, yes.
Just, sorry if you said it already, but I may have missed it. But so if you could say it again or explain. So how do you decide who's included to be represented in your sort of sample, as you were sort of mentioning, you had men, women and binary, non-binary, like, so, and you've only got 30 people, which is large.
Yeah.
How do you, what's relevant? How do you decide what's a sort of legitimate characteristic, I guess?
Yeah. And we can talk about this more at lunch. There, different people use different strategies. All the strategies are somewhat contested. For this one, we chose to use the idea that circulates in this field that people should be able to see themselves in the room. So that the general public should be able to look at the makeup of the jury and go, oh yeah, I can see that there's at least one person there that is a bit like me. Like I feel like the description of those people, there were other people that had the same educational background as me, or there were other people that were from the same ancestry as me, or there were I feel like there's people there that might have been similar to my experience. So that's one. There's all kinds of different logics that circulate though. There's discursive logics, there's lots of different ways of thinking. It's certainly not a settled area. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Stacy.
Thank
my
you.
God, it was so great. I just wanted to, before we end, I thought like we are continuing this conversation. I mean, we started last year with John and Mike, and then we had it all the conversation. And my intention is to continue this methodological debates. And next is with Mikey and Hillary and Nina and Eves. We are having this empirical ethics stream webinar on what the hell is empirical bioethics, which Mikey has decided to leave out what the hell or what is it actually. So no, what is empirical bioethics, right, Mikey? And could you please just put on the chat? I think I lost the track. Join again on through my laptop, but I'm happy to share with you once the webinar. It's happening on May 30. 1-3.
I saw that on Eve's Facebook.
Right. Oh, great. Eve has already been circulating. This is great, Mikey. Okay, yeah. Great. Thank you again.
Thanks
so much.
Thanks everyone at home.
You.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Let's continue with the conversation over the lunch. See you all. Thank you. Oh, shoot. Oh, really? But I think this.
Oh, maybe I see it now.